I want to introduce our first speaker, Brian Fies. I am so thrilled that he has agreed to open our workshop today. Those of you who are familiar with the whole graphic medicine and cartoon field, he's an Eisner Award winner for Mom's Cancer. You can see here, of course, I'm a big fan. I have this one. But what we thought would be such a great start to our workshop is that he had an online blog and more recently published a book about his experience with wildfire in Northern California. And the book is a fire story. I encourage you to get both of his books. And I understand he's working on a new project as well. So I'm looking forward to see how that goes. So maybe I will just hand this off to Brian, and I really look forward to hearing about your work. And let me just mute myself and pass it on to you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I hope everybody can hear me. Nods. Yes. Thank you. I'm just honored and thrilled to be asked to do this, and thanks to Dr. Lowe for asking me. I just think the work the Breathe Project is doing is interesting and important, and I'm proud to be a small part of it here today. So thank you. If it's okay with you all, we haven't practiced this, but I should be able to share my screen here. You see a lot of orange? Good. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about my work and my experience, and do some readings from the book, and just talk a little bit about my experience with wildfire and the short and long-term mental and physical effects of that on me and my family and the community around us. As Dr. Lowe suggested, I have a history as a graphic novelist. I've published. Got to get over here. There we go. I published my first graphic novel was Mom's Cancer, which was about my family's experience with my mom's diagnosis and treatment for metastatic lung cancer, which got quite some, put me on the map, got some notice. It's still, as I understand, being taught in some medical schools now as part of medical humanities curricula, giving future doctors and nurses some idea of how their patients might perceive them and how they might communicate better and that kind of thing. It's very gratifying legacy. My second book was called Whatever Happened to the World of Tomorrow, and it's about being a space age kid and getting to the age I am now and wondering why I'm not living on the moon with a jetpack like they promised me. And I have a book coming out this fall called The Last Mechanical Monster, which is just a silly, kind of dopey book. I had to remind myself that comics, while they can be serious and adult, can also just be fun. And so it's a fun story about an old man and a giant robot, and started as a webcomic and will be out this fall. And I'd contributed to some anthologies, and I'd done some little comics work here and there, but this was pretty much the extent of my comics career as of the night of October 9th, 2017, when my wife woke me up at 1 a.m. and we saw this coming over the horizon at us. This is the leading front of the Tubbs fire. I live in Northern California, by the way, Santa Rosa, which is about an hour north of San Francisco. And in 2017, we were in the news because we were one of 6,000 homes that burned down in one night. And so this was my fire. This was the Tubbs fire coming at us. This is an aerial view, or not an aerial view, but a more distant view of the same fire. Can you see my cursor when I move it around? You can see that. Good. Thank you. And all this down here, all this yellow stuff, that's just overexposed street light. But everything off on the horizon here, this is fire blowing from east to west and skipping as it goes on 60, 70, 80 mile an hour winds. And the best I can figure, my house is right around here in the middle of Mordor. So my fire looked like this. It started out, this is a map of the area. This is about 20 miles, 25 miles corner to corner diagonally here. Down here in the lower left, all these grays are houses in the northern reaches of Santa Rosa, California. Up here is Healdsburg, California, Windsor, California, Santa Rosa, California. And our fire started, this little yellow brown spot up in the upper left. That was the Calistoga fire, started about 9:15 p.m., or excuse me, the Tubbs fire. Half hour later, it grew into that. Half hour later, grew into that. Now, this is about the time my wife and I went to bed that night. And we turned on the 10 o'clock news. And, we saw a little story about a fire 20, 25 miles away. We didn't worry too much about it because it was a little fire 20, 25 miles away. And we went to sleep. Through the night, the winds blowing from east to west, dry, hot winds expanded the fire to there. And now you see red dots starting to appear. Every red dot is a destroyed or damaged, but more or less destroyed structure. Grew to there, grew to there. Midnight, 12:45, 1:15. Now, this is about when my wife woke up, and I'll tell you the story about that in a minute. But my wife woke up about then and woke us up and looked out the window and saw something desperately wrong because our house is down here. And she saw this coming at us. And we bundled up what we could as quickly as we could. We figure our house was destroyed about maybe about 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. And now this north to south here is Highway 101. That's a freeway that's 3 lanes each direction, 6 lanes. You think, well, that's a real nice natural fire break. That turned out not to be the case. It flew right over 101 like it was nothing. This business down here, this big cluster of red, you might have seen on the news, it's called Coffee Park. And there are about 1,500 homes destroyed just in this area alone. And that's the extent of the Tubbs fire from 9:15 to 3:45. In something like 6 hours, it started from a little fire up here and come down here and destroyed about 4,000 or 5,000 homes. So what it looked like from space, helped you get your bearings. Here, San Francisco Bay, and my home is right in here. Now, the thing about the Tubbs fire is it was just one of about 5 or 6 fires that started that night. We had fires all around us here. And we also had fires up in Mendocino County, which is heavily forested, not heavily populated, but heavily forested. And you can just see all this crap just blowing out over the Pacific Ocean. The next morning, I will again tell you the story in a second, but I walked into our neighborhood and I didn't know what I'd find. And there weren't any barricades up. There was one roadblock I walked past, but there really wasn't anybody to stop me because the firefighters and the police were still busy evacuating people and putting out fires. I didn't know that. I just started walking into our neighborhood, and that's what my block looked like. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's what my home looked like. I had a refrigerator, had I think that's a washing machine, had little spot fires all around. And I'm walking around in sandals like an idiot because that's the first piece of footwear I managed to grab as we evacuated the night before. That's what was closest to the bed was a pair of sandals. So I did not linger. I could still feel the heat from the fire coming up through the bottom of my shoes. The next day, we got somewhere safe. My wife worked through the day. And the next day I went to a Target store 30, 35 miles away. And I bought shoes because I needed shoes. And I bought shirts and underwear and socks and all the things you need when you evacuate without a lot of things. And I bought art supplies. The only art supplies I could find at Target was a spiral bound pad of really crappy paper, 4 colored highlighters, and a Sharpie pen. And I stole the pencil from my daughters. And I started drawing. Our story because my first job out of college, I was a newspaper reporter. So I've kind of got that journalist gene in me. And I realized that I'd accidentally got myself in the middle of a big story. And I felt an obligation to report on that big story. I realized it was, I was in the middle of a historic disaster, and I sort of saw myself as like a war correspondent reporting from the front lines of this disaster. I also think it gave me some sense of control in a situation in which I had no control. I couldn't fight the fire. I couldn't rescue anybody, but I could tell our story, and I could tell the story in my terms and my way. And my way was through comics. So in the next 3 days, I drew 18 pages of comic, and I'm going to read some of those to you. I excerpted a few pieces. And that's a blistering pace. And as you'll see, my drawing is not particularly polished. This is not artwork. I wouldn't hang it on the wall, but I think it's got a kind of an energy and power to it. So with your permission, I'd like to go through that, some of those pages that I did in the immediate days following our fire. On Monday, my house disappeared. Around 1 a.m., my wife Karen snapped awake. The electricity had gone out. She says, "I smell smoke." And I'm trying to play it off. I say, "That's just the Calistoga fire. It's 20 miles from here." Karen says, "The sky is glowing." So we get up, we start moving. Clothes I packed: 2 pairs of socks, striped t-shirt, sweatshirt, flannel shirt, toiletry bag, 2 tidy whities, plus the jeans, shirt, jacket, and sandals I put on. Stuff we grabbed: photo albums, a few framed photos and art, 1 copy of each of my books, some jewelry, drawer of important papers, computer backup, dog and cat and their stuff, our daughter's best stuffed buddies from infancy, Boo Bear and Piglet. And our dog and cat were totally confused by all of this, but we did manage to save them. We had neighbors who weren't able to save their pets, so that was a blessing. We and our neighbors kind of gathered in the street to watch this coming at us. And when a fire truck came around and said, "Evacuate now." So we did. California geology runs north and south. Napa and Sonoma counties are split by the small Mayacamas Mountains. My neighborhood lies along a creek that runs through them. Monday night, a blaze that began 20 miles away near Calistoga caught 50-mile-per-hour winds. A flaming front swept down the creek and broke over the hills like a napalm tsunami. We were at the tip of a bellows feeding a blast furnace. We didn't know any of that when we left at 1:30 a.m., fully expecting to return very soon. The idea of that distant glow in the sky actually making its way to us was ludicrous. And Karen asked, "Where should we go?" And I said, "Your office." Karen is director of Sonoma County Human Services, which is basically our social services department. Her office has a backup generator, phones, and internet, and a soda machine. It's also only a few miles from our house. We could hole up there. Besides, it was time for her to get to work. Between 2 and 7 a.m., Karen activated emergency phone trees, organized shelters, and planned the evacuation of a foster children's home as fire bore down from 3 sides. How many kids? No, you can't go west. The highway just closed. When will the cots arrive? She was too busy to think. At dawn, I set out to get as close to home as I could. And Karen said, "Don't do anything stupid." And I said, "Who, me?" The sun was a dim orange disk in a salmon gray curtain of smoke. I inhaled my neighbors' lives. I drove to the first roadblock, parked in a nearby lot, and started walking. I kept waiting for someone to stop me, but no one did. Took the same back streets we'd driven out a few hours before. These blocks looked all right. Everything would be just fine. The street made a gentle curve into our neighborhood. As I rounded it, I knew. Fuck. I hope there aren't any kids watching. Fuck, 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 fuck. I felt an obligation to be an honest reporter. That is exactly what I thought and said. I picked my way down the middle of the street to avoid smoldering debris, collapsed into gutters, alone on a sterile plain. Black toothpick trees, madly tilting chimneys, and the twisted steel frames of garage doors. Hell. A fire hose split and melted on the street. A valiant last stand routed into retreat. A fallen hoop that a boy lobbed balls at for hours every night after dinner. The steel posts of mailboxes bent like hot summer taffy. I turned into my street, stupidly hoping to see anything else. I used to have fried redwood trees in my front yard. I see a refrigerator in the rough shape of a car I used to have in my garage. I don't recognize anything else. A 2-story house full of my life was a 2-foot heap of dead smoking ash. Beginning the long trudge back, I passed a pristine Starbucks only a few hundred yards from my home. Starbucks? How is that fair? Karen was a hero the rest of the day. With 9/10 of her staff out, she led a team that improvised and problem solved. It was impressive. In quiet moments, we inventory lost treasures, each a swift stab to the heart. We didn't save the wrong stuff. We weren't those people who risked their lives for a jar of mustard. We just didn't save enough of it. And I will not read the list, but it is long and painful. We crashed at our daughter's apartment in clearer air 30 miles away, too exhausted to stay awake, but too amped up to sleep. On Tuesday, I bought shoes for walking and boots for digging. I saw things I'd needed 2 days earlier: furnace filters, printer ink, light bulbs, and realized I didn't anymore. It's unnerving to need both everything and nothing. You can tell at a glance if a shopper has lost everything they own: underwear, socks, shoes, water, toothbrush and paste, one light shirt, one heavy shirt. You look into their cart, they look into yours. Occasionally it sparks a conversation, usually a nod. My keyring has 5 keys. 3 of them don't do anything anymore. Front door, mailbox melted on sidewalk, car incinerated in garage. I wonder how long it'll be before I can bear to take them off. A few weeks later, I'm self-aware enough to recognize the classic symptoms: sleeplessness, loss of appetite, mental lapses, mood swings. Sadly, understanding trauma doesn't really help relieve it. After 2 weeks, we were allowed back to our house. It's a foot-deep fog bank of ash. Glass melted, china fused, concrete exploded, steel twisted, aluminum trickled down driveways. Maybe one day we'll appreciate our fresh start. Not yet, not for a long, long time. Well-meaning people say it's just stuff, but it was our stuff. Stuff we created, stuff we treasured, stuff from our ancestors we wanted our descendants to have. Stuff is a marker of time and memory. It's home. So as I said, I sort of did this with a journalistic impulse to get the word out. I wanted people to hear our story. And the best, quickest, cheapest, easiest way to do that is put it online. So I have a blog. I put it on a blog and told a few friends about it. And something like 700,000 people went and read this in the next 2 weeks. It went viral. And I take some, credit and gratification from that. I think I wrote it and told the story well, but I think what that's really about is what people told me, which is that they emailed me and said, I saw your fire in the news. I saw, the mushroom cloud rising over the Sonoma County plains, but your story is the first thing I read that made me understand what it was like to be there. And that's why I did it. And that's why it's a comic. And, that meant a lot to me. Notwithstanding the fact that I'm still dealing with my house burning down. So this was not the most important thing in the world to me at the time, but that meant a lot to me. As a result of that, our local PBS station, KQED, did an animated version of this. I sent them my art files and they animated them. And that actually won an Emmy Award for Best News Feature Story. And my publisher of my previous graphic novels wrote me a note and said, hey, Brian, no pressure on you, but if you ever want to turn that webcomic into a book, we'd love to publish it. And so here's my pro tip for anybody out there who wants to be a writer. When a publisher emails you and says, we'd like to publish your stuff, you say yes. And that became the book that Dr. Lowe held up at the beginning. And I took the opportunity to redo the art and the writing and expand the story. I looked at the webcomic as the first draft of that. So the prettied up version looks more like this. Very limited palette because I want to recapture that feel that I'd drawn it with highlighters and markers when in real life, of course, these days we do these things in Photoshop. But I really wanted to capture that feeling of only having a few colors to work with and having to work fast. I also wanted to expand the scope of the story because the original was 18 pages, great, but a book is bigger than that. So I wanted to expand the story in time, talk about a longer stretch of time. I wanted to talk about more space because I realized that my perspective was limited to where I was physically and where I was economically. So I want to talk to people, 5 miles away, 10 miles away, richer than me, poorer than me, and really try to tell the story of our fire as best I could. So, I got to talk a little bit more about our evacuation and that kind of thing. I want to talk about the context of our fire, about the California droughts and about Sonoma County's Mediterranean climate and how that just exacerbated everything, meaning that in a Mediterranean climate, you get some rain in the winter, but you don't get any rain in the spring, summer, or fall. So we got a lot of rain actually in the winter of 2016, which raised up this huge, enormous carpet of grass that made just wonderful kindling in the fall of 2017. I also wanted to talk about the science of the thing. And this is just me. This is my quirk. I think maybe I'm not hooked up right, but I really was fascinated by just poking through my own ashes and seeing what melted and what it looked like and what it turned into. So, I really became sort of a forensic investigator of my own fire, just trying to figure out how hot it got, and how fast it moved, and what melted at what temperature. And the one fascinating thing to me was you came back to a fire scene and everything metal had just completely rusted in 2 or 3 days, it looked like it'd been out there for 50 years. And I couldn't figure that out. So I, looked it up and found out that when a very hot fire comes by and it's just sucking oxygen into itself, it actually motivates these chemical reactions that, as I say, electron swap oxides such as hematite, magnetite turn into rust as they suck moisture from the air. The native clay soil, if you dug down under the ash, the soil was red. And I just found that fascinating. Like I say, maybe I'm not hooked up right, but I talked about that in the book as well. I also wanted to talk to more people, tell other people's fire stories. And I think the best part of my book is these interviews I did with other people about their fire stories. People ask how I found these people. And the fact is, some of them were friends, some of them were just people I started talking to. You really couldn't throw a rock around here without hitting somebody with a dramatic and interesting story. The guy on the left here, particularly Mike Harkins, was a friend of mine before the fire, but Mike spent the night of the fire running around his neighborhood with a garden hose, putting out spot fires, hundreds of spot fires as embers would come down. He'd be there with a garden hose to put it out. And he probably saved several houses on his block, but was unable to save his own. So when the firefighters show up in the morning, they got one look at him and said, that is either the bravest or stupidest man I've ever seen in my life. But he saved some homes. I'd like to just take a minute, well, after I drink this water, and talk about why a comic, because it's not the first medium you'd think of to tell a story. And graphic novels may be completely new to some of you, and they're mystifying to some folks who, maybe the last comic they read was Casper the Friendly Ghost when they were 7 years old. And so they think comics are juvenile, comics are supposed to be funny, comics cannot handle sophisticated, ideas or literature. I really push back on that. In the last 25, 35 years, comics have come into their own as a medium, not a genre. And what I mean by that is comics are a medium like film is a medium, or theatrical plays are a medium, or television is a medium, radio is a medium. It's a vehicle for telling a story. And it can be fiction or nonfiction, can be adult or juvenile, can be humorous or serious. Graphic novels have won Pulitzer prizes. There are graphic novels like Mouse about the Holocaust, Fun Home, that it became a Broadway play, New Kid that won the Newbery Medal, John Lewis's book series March, which is about Congressman John Lewis's civil rights activities, that won the National Book Award. Graphic novels are a medium which can be juvenile and can be, humorous, but don't have to be. So we're still kind of trying to get get our medium of choice over that hump. And it is the way I feel most comfortable telling stories, this combination of word and pictures that together transcend the sum of their parts. And I like to compare comics to popular music. If you think about your favorite song, and if you just wrote down the lyrics of your favorite song, they're usually pretty bad poetry. And if you just listen to the music of your favorite song, it's usually 3 repetitive chords that aren't particularly interesting. But if you put those mediocre words with that mediocre music, all of a sudden you've got a song that can take you back to the summer you were 16, or define a generation. And I think comics work in the same way. I think comics transcend the sum of their parts, partly because they distill ideas to their essence. And I have an illustration of that. My favorite example of comics distilling things to their essence is Charlie Brown. If you look at the face of Charlie Brown is 4 marks on a piece of paper. It's 2 dots, a half a circle, and a squiggly line. That's Charlie Brown. 4 black marks on a white piece of paper. And Charlie Brown will break your heart. Charlie Brown can rip your heart out. We empathize with Charlie Brown. We understand his pain when all the kids laugh at him because he got the wrong Christmas tree or he doesn't get any Valentines on Valentine's Day. We love Charlie Brown. We care what happens to Charlie Brown. That's amazing to me. The fact that we can pour our feelings into this very simple, very stylized representation of a human being. And I think partly that works because of something a cartoonist named Larry Gonick said one time. Larry said, our brains represent things in some stripped down, abstracted way. We don't remember things as photographs or movies. We remember them as cartoons. And I think that's right. I think that's how our brains work. When you think back to an important event in your life, you don't remember it in photographic detail. You don't remember what the carpet looked like or what the curtains were or what pictures were hanging on the wall. You remember what happened, who was there, how it made you feel. You remember that event stripped down to its essence. You remember a cartoon of that event. And I think that's why I love making comics as a medium, because when a comic's really working right, it feels like a telepathic tap from my head into the reader's brain with no intermediary, no processing necessary. They read it, they absorb the picture, they absorb the text, they knit them together in their own head, which kind of makes them like a co-conspirator in the storytelling process. And a comic can really work like that. So I've got just a couple more things I want to read, and then I'll kind of try to bring it around this whole idea of wildfire and health. This is again from A Fire Story. This is a 2-page spread. Being part of something so big makes perspective elusive. During the fire, we lived in a bubble. We saw very little television, heard nothing from the world outside. Friends and relatives across the country knew more about what was happening here than we did. Weeks later, we still lived in a bubble, a tiny bubble of our family, our property, our losses, our problems. Then we take a drive, mile after mile, hour after hour, ruin after ruin, thousands of other people's bubbles as real and urgent as ours. There's a ridge in the Fountain Grove neighborhood where you can look down into a valley a couple of miles below. On the other side of that valley is a distant ridge that parallels the one you're on. Beyond that ridge, a farther row of higher hills. Virtually everything you can see from horizon to horizon burned that night. All in all, the firestorm claimed about 350 square miles. It's a big number that by itself means nothing. It's about 15 Manhattans, 7.5 San Franciscos, 1.5 Chicago's, 1/3 of Rhode Island. Perspective. It's the horror and comfort of realizing you're not alone. This next bit happened a few weeks, probably maybe a month or two after the fire, when Karen and I are still back at our site, digging through and seeing if we can find anything that survived. Spoiler alert, we didn't find much. Oh, hell, here comes a chaplain. And Karen says, your turn. A group sent around crisis counselors from time to time. Hi, I say, and he says, you folks need some water? They were kind, earnest people who meant painfully well. Thanks, he says. We set up a food truck a few blocks over, free falafels. We'll come by in a while, thank you. He asks, how are you all doing? Oh, you know, same as everybody. Chaplain says, yeah, I've seen a lot of blocks that look just like this. At least we all got out alive. Chaplain says, there was an older couple over that way who got trapped in their garage. We heard. Horrible, but at least they perished together. I say, well, we're grateful. He says, not as bad as Hurricane Katrina, though. I saw bodies floating in ditches there. So the chaplain and I take a moment. And then I go back to work and Karen says, how'd it go? And I said, pretty well. He just needed someone to talk to. Now this is verbatim. I wrote this down 5 minutes later because I knew it was going in the book. And it struck me at the time as just the sort of blackest, funniest thing that had happened in a long time. And it only struck me later how deeply sad it was, because all this man wanted to do was to try to help. And all he was doing was being a burden because he was just totally burned out. He'd given too much. He'd been to too many disasters. His own mental health was not he wasn't mentally healthy enough to be there to help other people through their problems. He needed help with his. He was more damaged than we were. He was not doing us any good at all, but by God, he was giving it his all. And it just, it was funny, but it also simultaneously broke my heart. One thing we gained through this process was unexpected expertise. My wife and I and all of our neighbors have become experts at discerning wood, paper, electrical, plastic, charcoal, propane, natural gas, and residential fires. I can name that fire. We can be walking around and we can feel a sniff of smoke in the air, and we can tell you exactly what it is and what's burning and probably how far away it is. Our rental house was in a semi-rural area. It wasn't unusual to smell fireplace smoke. This was different. I yelled to Karen, "Hey, I'm going to take a little drive and see where that smoke's coming from." I'm driving, I'm following the plume, I'm looking at the wisp. Out in the country, it's legal to burn yard waste, leaves, grass, branches, everything's fine. I didn't think much of it until a few days later when I mentioned it to a man who also lost his house in the fire, and he confessed he chased down a harmless smoke plume too. I wouldn't have been so alert and diligent before my home burned down. I see it as a socially responsible form of PTSD. So lasting health impacts, physical and mental, to be determined. I don't know. We'll see. Karen and I were sitting on the couch one day and we had this conversation. I can't read the top of it because I got a little thing up there. It's off the top of my screen, but it's basically Karen and I going over the stimuli that shoot a potent dose of adrenaline into our bloodstreams. She says, wood smoke. I say sirens. Karen says, strong wind. I say, especially strong, dry wind from the east. Roaring sounds. Traveling the same route I walked home the morning after the fire. Helicopters at night. I say, reminders of the 2017 solar eclipse that the girls and I drove to Oregon to see. It had nothing to do with the fire, but was so close in time, they've become entwined in my mind. Karen says, the Macy Gray song, Beauty in the World, which I cried to in my car every day so I wouldn't cry at work. I say, the Toy Story movies. I lost my childhood teddy bear in the fire. I know he wasn't really alive, but he was when I was 3. Karen says, escape routes. Every room, every hotel, every city. I always make sure I have a way out. I comment, it's a weird set of triggers, but manageable. So we are aware, I'm sorry, this is another reading. I've met other fires who share my irrational shame that I let down history. And I met this woman on a book signing for my hardcover edition of the book. She says, I was the keeper of my family's past. I had everyone's antiques from the old country, all their treasures. Some of them are more than 400 years old. My great-grandparents packed them up, brought them to America, carried them across the country, and entrusted them to me. And I let them burn. You know, there's nothing you could have done, I told her. She said, it doesn't matter. It happened on my watch. In the chain of posterity, we were the links that broke. So as I started to say, we are aware that people are interested in the long-term effect of our fire, both mentally and physically. I have not been involved in any of those studies and not been a subject of them, but I know people who have. There have been papers, on the subject of short-term and long-term effects. I'm sure that you're all the experts on those. You've probably written some of these papers. These are, as far as I know, are going to be ongoing longitudinal studies that are going to follow at least some of us for years and years to come. I wonder, and I think that's great. We've also, we're ideal subjects for that kind of thing because there are other fires too in subsequent years. My fire, the Tubbs fire, was in 2017 the most destructive wildfire in California history. That record was broken in 2018 by the Camp Fire up in Paradise and Chico, whose smoke blew west toward the Pacific Ocean and then took a left turn and coated us for a week or 2 or 3. So after we, choked through weeks of smoke in 2017, we did the same thing in 2018. This was an eerie fire. I woke up the morning of the campfire, stepped at my door, and was positive that fire was a block away instead of, 200 or 300 miles away. It was just, it was the worst kind of flashback. It just raised a panic in me, like, oh my God, I've got to start packing. And then I checked the news and said, okay, I think I'm okay with this one. So the studies continue. What I was going to say was what interests me, or what I'm curious about, is sort of the long-term effects, not just physically, but mentally. There's a generation of kids here who lost their home when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Everything burned. They fled for their lives. Now it's almost 5 years later, and those kids are growing up, and they've been through COVID, for God's sake. I really wonder what that does to you when you're 30, when you're 40, when you're 50. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's got to have some lingering effect. Resilience. Kintsugi is the centuries-old Japanese art of repairing broken ceramics with gold. Instead of trying to hide damage, kintsugi highlights and celebrates it as part of the object's history. I have a deep appreciation for kintsugi as I watch my neighborhood rebuild. Some survivors want all evidence of the fire erased, plowed under, paved over, painted away. I understand but disagree. I like my warped and rusted iron gate and the spots where our burning trash cans melted the street. These occasional smaller reminders don't bother me. They tell our story. They're the scars we earned. Our kintsugi. I just want to quickly run down some lessons learned from our fire. I know that's not particularly directly the purview, but I think there's maybe some connection here. One thing we learned is the importance of organization and responsibility in these kinds of things. In the 2017 fire, responsibility for firefighting was divided among many agencies. Every city had its fire department. The county has a fire department. CAL FIRE was involved, and they just weren't talking to each other effectively. So what we did in Sonoma County is we developed an Office of Emergency Management that oversees them all, links them all, connects them all, and is the funnel through which all information flows in future disasters like that. Seems to be working well, as we've learned in subsequent fires. Very important to get everybody on the same page and talking, instead of a situation like we had in 2017, where firefighters from one agency were going to help firefighters in another agency and met their counterparts coming the opposite way to help them, meeting in the middle of the street saying, "There's fire behind me." Well, there's fire behind me too. And they should have just stayed where they were and fought their own darn fires. The technology can help us out a lot. We've made a lot of progress in this area. Fire cams and codes. And since 2017, Sonoma County has installed 27 new wildlife cameras. I think more than that by now. Basically, we put fire cameras on top of everything that was higher than a bump in the road, and all armed with artificial intelligence to spot a plume and triangulate it and just hit it with as many resources as we could, as hard and fast as we could. Also, fire codes have changed a lot. My house that burned down was 30 years old. In the 30 years between then and 2017, fire codes had changed to make buildings more fire resistant. We're not allowed to use wood siding anymore. We use a product called Hardy Board or Hardy Plank, which is part cement. It looks like wood, but it's made out of 50 or 60 or 70% cement. They've redesigned eaves so that fire can't get sucked up into attics as easily anymore. Every residential home, I think in California now, has to have fire sprinklers. So these are all good things that I think will help prevent the next disaster. Information pushed to the public. You can't go to a county fair or a meeting of more than 5 people around Sonoma County without finding a little table passing out red backpacks with go bags in them, with the little first aid kit, the flashlight, and everything you need in a disaster. This is a big deal. We're very fire alert in ways we weren't before, and I wish it would not take a fire to make other communities as fire alert as we are up here. But we all know what a red flag warning means now. We've got these new boards all over the place. This one in particular is about a block from my house, and it was an Eagle Scout project from this Boy Scout here. But we're very diligent, very attentive these days. Institutions, active and ongoing. An emergency plan cannot just be a dusty binder you pull off the shelf, which was literally the case in 2017. It has to be a living document and process that everybody knows, everybody understands their part. And I like to conclude with some quotes from a county supervisor whom I interviewed, County Supervisor James Gore, who was basically the politician responsible for much of the land that burned. And I interviewed him, and he said, the idea of resilience is not that you never get hit. It's that when you do get hit, you can take it. People talk about the new normal in the context of it being a horrible, apocalyptic, changing environment. I say that the new normal is how we rise to that challenge. The new normal is us. And with that, I'd like to leave you with a picture of daffodils, because in my book, daffodils, I never tell anybody how to interpret my book. Whatever the reader gets out of it is what they get out of it. And sometimes I hear some pretty wild things. But if somebody wanted to look at a drawing of daffodils and see in that a symbol of renewal and life from death and rebirth and color from colorlessness, that is not an interpretation that I would discourage. And with that, I'll stop sharing and would be very happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much. That was such a great, powerful story. I was going to make a few comments before I go to questions. So you started off talking about, the kind of the graphic arts and as a medium. And in a situation, in a story like this, I was thinking there are a couple of things where the graphic representation is so much more powerful than other types of things. I mean, I read a lot, if I read a lot of books, but the comics do something that are able to convey some of the emotional content because of the visual aspects. The thing about the fire was really striking is that you have a simultaneous situation where the glow of the fire, the bright colors, contrasts with the aftermath, where everything is monochromatic.
Right.
And again, the ability of the graphic medium to really convey that really starkness. The other thing about your book, which I thought was really so effective, is that there is the time scale. There's the immediacy of the emergency, and then the aftermath too is almost timeless in the way that suddenly everything stops and there's just this aftermath. And again, the visual aspect, how time stops, is just again a really powerful aspect of it.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's something that comics can probably convey better than any other medium I can think of. So thank you for that.
Another thing I thought the Charlie Brown image was pretty effective, because I remember an exhibit a while ago displaying Matisse and Picasso kind of side by side, and I think, to me, what I took home from that is that a simple line can convey so much information, whether it's emotional or just three-dimensional information or depth or things like that. And again, of course, you are a great artist, but again, the ability of that simple line to convey that much information is just great. The thing I started off with is, the Breathe Center is very multidisciplinary, and I talked about air quality and health impacts, and you really brought out the important part of it, is that we're not just worried about our lungs, breathing in the smoke. We're actually talking about resilience, mental health, those kinds of things, because when you talk about whether the new normal is being prepared or being resilient, it's also the broader perspective of these kinds of now an acknowledgement that a lot of these kinds of devastating things can happen, pandemics, Ukraine, the destruction of whole cities, those kinds of impacts, and that we had kind of come accustomed to the post-war period as being something where everything is going to be bright and shiny and we're always going to be protected and things like that. I think we're back to more of the pre-war, perspective and understanding that, maybe it's a slightly different set of circumstances, like, the fire or pandemic or something like that can just take everything away in an instant. but the idea that we have always tended to set aside questions of mental health, set aside these kinds of questions of recovery and resilience. So this is I think this is a really important part of what this story is about.
Agreed. I can't argue with the thing you said. I think you're right. I mean, I think that is the story, I appreciate your early comments about, the power of a line. My platonic ideal comic, the thing I always am aiming for is one single line on a piece of paper that says exactly what I want it to say. If I could achieve that, I'd consider, career well done. I never have. Usually it takes me more than one line, but I often say that, if you want to know exactly what happened, if you want to know what happened in a thing, well, then you want a video or you want a movie of the thing. If you want to know what it felt like, what that experience felt like, then you want a cartoon, because then you get the emotional expressed visually, and it's just it's a powerful medium when it's really working.
So I'll ask a question. Maybe I'll ask a question now. So I'll give a little brief promotion. Later on this morning, I'm going to show some of the work we're doing in Inland California and the comics we work to develop to communicate with the communities. And I think one of the things that you brought out was this whole journalistic approach. And when I train our students and things like that, part of what I try to emphasize is the power of the narrative. That you can't just throw data at somebody and get them to understand it, that the story is an important part of it. And so, you've covered a lot of different subjects in your work. So I guess the question is that as we get to things like climate change, these questions of mental health and resilience, and I know you touch on a little bit these things with the mom's cancer, things like that. Have you seen a lot of where science, whether it's related to COVID, whether it's related to climate change and things like that, has basically failed because they don't appreciate that kind of power of the narrative? And have you kind of thought about whether or not you have something to contribute to that?
I think about that all the time. I think that's a deep and important question. What I've come to believe more and more strongly as time goes by is that human beings, we're just we're storytellers and story listeners. It's how we understand the world, is through storytelling. Now, I was a physics major in college. I consider myself sort of a scientist at heart, and I wish that reason and data were enough to persuade people, but they're clearly not. People are not rational, reasonable beings. They're storytelling and story absorbing machines, and so I think I think narrative is incredibly important. Probably. Now, I've also I abandoned a project which was going to be basically a graphic novel treatment of cosmology. I was trying to figure out a way to deliver science in this medium of mine, and it's really hard to avoid just turning it into a talking head lecture, basically a PowerPoint with a little cartoon figure in the corner saying, well, here's how general relativity works. That's baloney. That's not using the medium well. It's just dumbing it down unnecessarily. So that's a tough nut to crack. I've thought hard about it, and I don't know. I can't answer the question because I haven't solved that problem. I don't know if anybody has, but I think it's an important one to solve, especially when we're talking about things like climate change, which work on such large and subtle timescales that none of us can wake up today and say, oh, this is a climate change day where tomorrow wasn't. But I've become more convinced than ever, even since 2017, that my book is a story about living in a climate changed world. I mean, that's its subtext. And I didn't even realize that when I wrote it, but as subsequent years went by and every single freaking year has another biggest fire ever, I'm like, this is not right. This is different. This is weird. And I sort of see my book as an early bell saying, hey, this is what it's going to be like now, and it's not going to be good, and we better be ready for it. So that's, if my book has a subtext, that's it. I don't know. I don't feel like I answered your question well, because I don't have a good answer for it, but story and narrative is incredibly important. Does not take the place of science and data, but science and data are not as persuasive as story. So good luck to y'all.
So maybe I'll ask a related question, which will kind of extend on that. Monica's asking a question about, challenging scientists. Like, how do we respond? How do we present? What is the challenge to the scientists? And maybe I'll add to that. It's like, is there advice, and how do we approach this question of providing the right kind of effective narrative?
You may be above my pay grade. I just want to first say thank you to Kristen for her note about, that was a very powerful story. Thank you very much. I just want to make sure you knew I saw that and appreciate it very much. And also to Monica. Is there something you wish to challenge us as research to respond? I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. It's a very smart question. I don't know how to answer it. I'll have to think about it for about an hour. Get back to you. I'll think about it. Maybe a day, maybe two. I don't know. You're asking. It's a real tough thing. It's as I said before, it's kind of a tough nut to crack, and I haven't cracked it. If I did, I'd be selling, 1 million copies of the thing, and everyone would think the way I do about things.
But
I'm sorry.
There is more of a recognition of the graphic form as a medium, and so as that begins to make its way into the heads of scientists, then I have a couple bookshelves of graphic novels and things like where these things are told, and it just needs to get to the students and researchers to say, well, this is a great example of what you need to aspire to.
Yeah, well, where comics excel, what they are really good at is metaphor and symbolism, because you can just show the metaphor without having to describe it or explain it and so forth and so on. Science also excels at metaphor and symbolism. I mean, I in this book I was talking about that I will never do now, Albert Einstein himself came up with the metaphor of space-time as a stretched rubber sheet, and gravitational wells as bowling balls in that sheet. That's beautiful. You can draw that. You can draw that, and everybody can understand it. You have to be careful with that kind of thing. First of all, not to oversimplify, not dumb it down too much. You want to be sure you're conveying still accurate scientific information that's useful or not misleading. And it's very easy when you're talking about metaphors to dumb down too far. But I think there's a connection there between the power of comics to immediately convey metaphor in a way that the reader can just say, "Oh, I get it. I understand what you're trying to tell me. Now I know how a COVID virus works. I get it." With I don't know, hooks and balls or whatever COVID viruses do, Velcro, and science. I mean, science is always searching for that metaphor that communicates accurately to the layman what the situation was, what their research shows, and so on and so forth. And some scientists are really good at it, some scientists are really bad at it. And I think maybe thinking graphically is a different tool in the toolbox. Maybe you should be using, because you're struggling with the right words. If you can't find the right words, maybe you can find the right image.
Well, it's funny because we spend a fair amount of time trying to make our data figures look pretty.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's a little misplaced. So Iqbal has an interesting question. So are there limitations to this medium?
Yeah, I think of graphic novels as a, and this is an ill-formed thought, but as a low density medium, I think of graphic novel as comparable to containing about the same amount of information per per hour, per mile, per whatever, as maybe a movie or a play. They're pretty lean and you can read them pretty fast. I have not yet figured out a way to teach quantum mechanics in graphic novel form, or even a good novel. I mean, if you tried, I remember in high school, I tried to adapt Red Badge of Courage as a graphic novel. And it took me like 8 pages just to draw the first page of Red Badge of Courage. So, in my opinion, many people have tried to do graphic novel representations of, say, Dickens. And it doesn't work, in my opinion, because the joy of Dickens is the prose. You can't
Right.
chop 80% of Dickens out and still have Dickens. You got to read all of Dickens to get Dickens. So I think all text novels are more dense and therefore maybe can be more complex. But on the other hand, there's nothing like the cliche is a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I think there's some truth to that. The right picture can carry a lot of the same weight as hundreds or thousands of words of prose in the right hands. But I think there are some, I'm not the first one to note that most successful graphic novels, your Fun Home, Persepolis, Mouse, most of my stuff, they're all tend to be these kind of memoirs or internally driven things or firsthand life experiences. And I think that kind of goes back to that point I made about memories being like cartoons. And that sort of telepathy that happens when you're reading a graphic novel, it feels like someone's sitting there telling a story to you. Well, that's fine, but that's not the right method of delivery for all kinds of information. So maybe that's part of it. So yeah, I think they do have limitations, but I think we're kind of poking at the edges of that frontier, pushing back those limitations. And I think it's a young medium with huge potential. I mean, this whole field of graphic medicine I've been involved in, and Dr. Lowe, you alluded to this whole idea of people reading books like Mom's Cancer and getting something out of it and teaching them in medical schools. That didn't exist 20 years ago. That started in 2010 with a graphic medicine conference in London. And so the whole field of graphic medicine is 12 years old, and it's kind of exploding. And I got on the ground floor of that, and I think there's other untapped ways of using comics and graphics that have yet to be discovered.
So relating to the mental health aspect, many of the graphic medicine type books are personal stories, and then others are a little bit more relating to a broader audience. And I guess the question is, like, as an artist, how much of that is therapeutic versus, personally, versus how much of it is, trying to help directly targeted at others?
Well, there's what you intend and what actually happens. Pika sort of has a similar question here about what I say writing the story was my way of healing from the calamity. It's funny because with both Mom's Cancer and Fire Story, the first thing my wife said was, well, it'll be good therapy for you. And I think that's sort of true. I think in order to write about something, you have to sort of understand it and understand your own feelings about it, and question yourself, interrogate yourself about why you're feeling what you're feeling. And I think that's an aspect of therapy. On the other hand, in order to write a book about a thing, you've really got to kind of immerse yourself in it for a long time. It takes, a year or 2 years to write a book. And 5 years after my house burned down, I'm doing events like this where I get to tell everybody about the night my house burned down. So I'm not sure that's healing. it's in some senses, it kind of feels like just keep picking that scab. But particularly when I did Mom's Cancer, I really thought my goal in doing Mom's Cancer was write a book that would be a roadmap for people coming down the cancer road behind us. Because my family and I kept getting surprised by these events and things and interactions with the medical establishment. And so I wanted to write this roadmap, and it sort of became that. It turned out that people with cancer weren't interested in the book at all because they had cancer and they were already experts on it. And they didn't, in their spare time, want to read a book about cancer. But it was useful for the people around them. And then this whole this whole graphic medicine thing where it turned out doctors and nurses and pastors and, people were telling me, I'm going to change the way I do my job because of what was in your book. That came out of the blue. That was not my intent. And it was just like, that's amazing. Similar thing with a fire story, I think, is I really felt like I had no choice but to write it. I just had to get the story out. I had to kind of vomit it out in the world. And then what it became was what it became. But what I hear from is people who weren't in fires, but they were in hurricanes or tornadoes. And they say, you told my family's story. And I think the real important result of doing something like a fire story or mom's cancer is having people out there understand that they're not alone, that somebody else has been through the same thing they are. I think that's immensely therapeutic for them and for the person who told the story. Is just to realize that, we're kind of all in this together. That sounds like a sort of a cliche, but I think it's the thing that really sticks with me is just that sense of connection with somebody else, the storytelling. We're storytellers.
So I was seeing two contrasting things. I see Mia has a question about kintsugi. And then you also mentioned the talking to a woman who lost all of the family's physical history. And I guess the question is, people must maybe feel there's different approaches. Someday, like this works, that doesn't work. So the kintsugi thing is really interesting. Like that's if you have a physical piece to help, give you that reminder of, resilience, moving on, those sorts of things, versus, well, what if you lost it? So what are the, I imagine there must be many different approaches, and how do you go about finding the thing that works?
Well, everybody's got their own way and everybody's got a different reaction, and there are no right or wrong ones, but I think there are more or less effective ones. It's a good question. It's a good question with 1,000 answers, depending on who you asked. For example, I showed that one slide of the fire alert board that has, the arrow pointed to red fire warning day. And there were a few people in our neighborhood who were very traumatized by that, because they said, I don't want to drive by that corner every day and have a reminder that my house burned down. And the rest of us are like, the point of the board is to keep houses from burning down. Well, I'm thrilled to see the thing, but they weren't ready for that. I talk in the book about the metaphor of our fire being a black hole, that my wife and I were among the people who just sort of orbited this gravitational well eternally of just waiting and waiting and waiting, where some people were sucked into it. Some people committed suicide. Some people, we know people who died prematurely because of the stress of the fire. It just ruined them, and they sort of lost the will to live. And we know there are people who were just ejected from the gravity well of the black hole, that shot off and moved 3,000 miles away, and we never heard from them again or saw them again. There's no right or wrong answer to that, but kind of tying into Mia's aspect of the mental health benefits for Sonoma County fire survivors participating in community-driven science-based initiatives. I think it's important. It's that sense of duty, that sense of wanting to get something good out of this horrible thing, wanting to take this horrible thing that happened and create something good out of it. That was part of my impetus for doing the book. It's part of the impetus for people who are out there doing these community-driven science-based initiatives to restore the wildlands or restore the parks. There's a lot of that going on, and it's a strong impulse. It's that impulse of, I've got to do something positive, and thousands of people are doing that as their process of getting through the fire. But I got to be honest with you, a lot of people just kind of curled up into a ball, and they're just going to be curled up in a ball for years and years and years. And my wife and I will never be the same. I mean, it's one of those events. The only thing I can compare it to is having kids that just divide your life into before and after. And we still talk about BF before fire and AF after fire. And I swear to God, yesterday we were looking for something in the kitchen, and we just kind of looked at each other and say, oh, we had that before the fire. Or I had, my neighbor asked, do you have a staple gun? I had no idea if I had a staple gun. I used to, Turns out I don't have a staple gun anymore. Every day is just this sort of weight of melancholy, which doesn't mean that our lives are joyless and we're in a beautiful new home and we experience joy and happiness, but there's just sort of this, we're different, we're different. And I don't know if it's worse, but it's not better, but we're maybe, I don't know, smarter, wiser than we were before. We've been knocked down and punched in the face, and now we know we can get up from that. I don't know. I think I just had a whole therapy session that had nothing to do with your question, but.
Well, I think this is part of something that, there'll be more of these incidents. Climate change, more wildfires and so on. And so I think it's good to get us started on this track and pay attention to all the different approaches. But thank you so much. We're going to have to close in this discussion and move on to the next. Are you going to be in Chicago for the graphic medicine?
Graphic medicine, yeah, I will. I'm planning on being there,
Okay,
barring
great.
COVID resurgence and stuff.
I hope to see you. Okay, thank you again, Brian Fies. Everybody, thanks very much.
And thanks also to Jim. I'm living in Colton here. I read your comment and don't really have anything to say about it except just planning ahead. And but then, as Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So sorry, Jim.
All right, thanks.